Hello, I'm Jeff Light, editor and publisher of the San Diego Union-Tribune, and your host for this evening. Welcome to the third and final event in the Kroc School's Democracy for All of Us series. The Kroc School has organized this series in order to explore, with some of the most interesting thinkers in the country, the following question. As we emerge from the crises of 2020, how do we rebuild trust and create a more just and inclusive society? Tonight's event is called Pulling Together, Democracy and Solving Big Problems. The first two events in the series focused on our immediate political and social crises. This evening, we want to take a longer view. How do we, as a society, begin to pull together to address the really big issues? Problems like climate change, systemic racism, injustice, gender inequity. With us tonight are three distinguished guests. First, Nicaila Jefferson. Nicaila is a founder of Sunrise San Diego, part of a national movement to organize against climate change. She is a Public Voices Fellow of the Op-Ed Project and of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. Also with us tonight, Dr. Patricia Marquez, Dean of the University of San Diego's Kroc School of Peace Studies. The Kroc School prepares students from around the world for peace building, conflict resolution, social innovation, and the advancement of human rights. And finally, Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is a professor at University of Massachusetts at Amherst and the founder of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, which is leading the search for alternatives to the commercial internet. His latest book is Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform them. So let's begin tonight's conversation. Nikayla, I thought we should start with you, because when you talk about the big problems, nothing's bigger than climate change. And you have a way, I think, of talking about the issue that's very personal as well. And I wonder if you might share with us the kind of personal stakes that you feel in the climate change battle. And I've seen some nice storytelling by you that really brings this home.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. But your question there, I think I'd like to push back on that a little.
Okay.
I think climate change, while it is an existential threat, right, it's not the biggest existential threat that we face as people. I mean, speaking as a queer Black woman myself, climate change is just the latest that we have to deal with as people. But how I feel climate change personally, and the stories I tell around that, I've lived in California my entire life. Sorry, is my Wi-Fi awful?
No, you're good.
Fine? Okay. I've lived in California my whole life, and over the past 24 years, how this state has transformed for the worse. The wildfires and the droughts and the sea level rise, and I'm a backpacker, right? High Sierras feel like a second home to me. And every time I leave the trail, I wonder, will I be able to come back? So the climate crisis is deeply, deeply personal to me. And that's part of the reason why I organize against it.
Yeah, I think I've seen you tell a story just about a drive across the state, I think from your grandmother's house to your home in San Diego through the wildfires of last summer, and how you were not only feeling that palpable threat, but you were also able to connect environmental justice to all the other pressing problems of the day. Could you share that a little bit?
Yeah, back in August, I was driving home from a backpacking trip up in Washington State. And driving home through the wildfires, 600 of them, broke records across the book in the state of California for fires last year. And connecting the crisis, it was for a really, I guess, a good example of how I felt this. It was driving through wildfires as a Californian and as a backpacker and someone who so deeply feels the tragedy of the crisis happening around her. Orange skies, ash falling like rain on my windshield, but additionally, absolutely terrified of being pulled over by highway patrol because I'm brown and I have curly hair. And I know that they profile me. So it's all these correct in the form of their threats in my natural environment as a human being, my natural environment as a Californian, it's not the, Yosemite National Park, it's San Diego. That is my lived and loved and built environment, and police officers and toxic air, they're two threats that I face.
Yeah, when we talked earlier, you put this in a context of really having no faith in the institutions of our society. How does that play into your thinking?
I'm of a generation Generation Z that has watched our entire lives. Institutions absolutely fail around us. I mean, growing up, one of the earliest things I remember is 9/11, and then being at war. We're still at war. Been at war for what, 18, 19 years at this point? My entire life, we've been at war. Watching the economy collapse in 2008 and people not being cared for, people losing their homes and their retirement accounts, and the big banks being bailed out. Watching people have to choose between rent and healthcare, like not being able to afford food, and latest with COVID, like the mutual aid that we were trying to establish in San Diego, it saved a lot of people's lives, but it's not our job. Like that should be the job of the government, is to respond to a pandemic, like not people who are already working a minimum wage job, just trying to care for the people around them. The institutions in this country don't work. Democracy hardly works. I feel like we're hanging on by a thread here. And if we almost had that thread cut in November, but we need total reform across the board, a revolutionary approach to how we're going to fix the United States of America.
Great. So Ethan, your latest work tells the story of how trust in America has eroded across just about every facet of public life. And I think we see that all around us, and we see it especially in young, socially conscious leaders like Nicaila. Can you describe for us what your research has found about trust in public institutions?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that I wrote Mistrust because I have a lot of students like Nicaila who are deeply engaged with social change and are feeling like the ways in which they're told to make social change just aren't working. At a moment where it feels like many of our institutions are failing us, going to students and saying, it's fine, organize for a political candidate and vote, or even go out in the street and protest, and maybe you'll persuade your political leaders to behave differently, those promises ring somewhat hollow. And what I was interested in was how we got here. How did we get to the point where incredibly smart, engaged students who are interested in social change often feel very hopeless and feel like the institutions are holding them back rather than moving them forward? What's interesting is that you can find the roots of this change as far back as the 1970s. When you look at how Americans express trust in government, we've gone from being an incredibly trusting people. If you polled the American populace in the mid-1960s, 3 out of 4 Americans would tell you that they trusted the government in Washington all or most of the time. If you poll Americans now, fewer than 1 in 5 will tell you that they trust the government in Washington. And we've seen similar collapse of trust in other institutions, everything from universities to newspapers, just to implicate both of us, Jeff, but bringing in the church, big business, everything else. We've seen, with the exception of the military, every major institution in society has declined in trust. And this starts happening in the 1970s. It accelerates and has been really profound in the last 15 years or so. When we try to figure out why it is, some of the hypotheses we have to put on the table are pretty big. During that same period, from the 1970s to the present, inequality has massively increased in the United States. We've moved to a strategy of government where we are much less interested in building public goods and much more interested in limited government. And at the same time, we have a more critical public, which is able to look at the ways in which institutions are failing them and ask this question of who should be held accountable. So all of this is really coming down to a moment of reckoning for the institutions that serve us the least well. And when I look at movements like the movement for Black Lives and specifically defund the police, this is a logical extension of an institution that hasn't figured out how to change over time and is now facing people saying, look, we literally need to clear the slate and just rethink what this institution should be. We have to actually start not from the police, but from this idea of public safety and how would we actually create an institution to do it.
Yeah, this the acceleration, if there is one, in the erosion of trust. How much of that has to do with the weaponization of mistrust, the platforms of mistrust? Like maybe this is all, and I know I've heard you talk about the recency bias that we all exhibit in looking at this problem, but what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, this is what's great about trying to look at things through a historical lens. The most dramatic drop in confidence in government in the United States happens between about 1971 and 1980. And if you think about it, you've got Nixon and Watergate, you've got Vietnam, you have the energy crisis, and you have stagflation under Carter. So not a good decade for anybody. But real hard to pin it on the internet and social media, since the internet in 1969 is basically 4 computers in California and Utah talking to one another. That's probably not the problem. I do think recently we've seen a real twist where I think, the Republican Party in particular has weaponized mistrust, has sort of realized that mistrust is really sort of endemic in the population. And we've now had a political leader do something that we've really never seen before. We've had a leader stand up and say, you know what, you're right not to trust any of these systems. They're all broken. They're all rigged. Just trust me. That's the rhetoric of the deep state. And we've really never seen anyone in a position of as much power as President Trump try that strategy. We don't know what the consequences of that are going to be yet. I think one obvious consequence is that 2/3 of Republicans don't feel that the 2020 election was free or fair. That is an erosion of confidence in an institution, frankly, an institution that actually works reasonably well, putting aside the whole electoral college, gerrymandering, and suppression of Black and brown people. Putting those things aside, we probably did hold a relatively free and fair election, but now we have, 2/3 of half of our population persuaded that wasn't in fact free or fair.
Yeah, there's a lot to come back to here. Let's move on for a minute to Patricia. Patricia, I think you bring an interesting perspective. You're an anthropologist by your scholarship. You grew up in Venezuela, which I think is a place many of us think about when we talk about issues of collapse of trust. And when I talked to you earlier, you spoke of the illusion of harmony, the illusion of progress. And it sort of brought to mind for me the question of, what was it like in the moment? How does one come to realize you're living in a failing society, and as we maybe living in one now?
Well, I think Venezuela is definitely a failed state. I think in the U.S. we have serious issues that need to be addressed, but I think it's a very different story. But going back to Venezuela, and I think about institutions, we always had a sense, and maybe that's what we trusted, that they would work in not just one direction, they would work in multiple pathways, let's put it like that, to make it simple. So that meant that when you needed a service or you needed something from an institution, you had to figure it out, again, what your strategy would be. It could be something that would take a long time, a lot of going back and forth. It could be that you knew somebody, or ultimately you pay somebody to get the service that you needed. But at the end of the day, it was a general sense in the population that they had a good intention at heart. Our institutions, even if they didn't always work as we thought, it would be just one path. What I think broke in Venezuela, or it felt to me that we couldn't really trust, when you got a sense that they no longer had that intention to serve. And I felt it very personally when I was trying to get a passport, and it was taking really long time. This is back in 2007. And I had a newspaper column, and I was wondering if they were targeting me for political reasons, which is something I never felt or experienced before. I finally got it, but it took like months of going and pushing to get it. I think that is not the story here. I do think there is, as many of the speakers today or in the previous two series said, there is a fragility. Democracy is a process, and that fragility is felt, and there are many issues that have come on the surface in the last 4 years, like I think Ethan and Akela have mentioned. I do think that Trump injected a virus within, sort of the idea of institutions, that they were listening even less. So one of the things that I am concerned, and I believe that pulling together we can address, is that organizations and institutions need to listen. So people drive change, and there's a lot of mistrust, and as Ethan says, it fuels that change. So I'm inspired by people like Michaela and some of the other speakers we have had, because I can see that they're driving change, and that mistrust is linked to that with good reason. And good institutions have to listen. And I think in this country, a lot of that listening has been lost. It has been weakened, and it needs to come back. I feel very hopeful. So if you see some of the major issues of this country, that we have, I would say, a majority of consensus, from childcare to health to abortion to women's rights to racial justice. There's a lot of consensus. It doesn't mean 100%, but I think institutions have been deaf, tone deaf to this, and something's got to change. That was very different from my context in Venezuela, where I can tell you right now, nothing works, or very little works. And I think that this country, a lot of things still work very well, as Ethan mentioned. Perfect? No. Is there a need for great change in many areas? Definitely. But there's still many things that work, and I think it's important that we don't lose sight of those things, and we actually leverage those things to continue to create change by individuals and groups of people that are doing the kind of work that Nikela and others are doing.
Yeah, interesting perspective, because I think, over the last years and months, a lot of people in America were looking around and saying, "Oh my God, is this what it looks like? Is this what the end days of the society we know, of democracy as we know it? Is it happening to us?" And having lived that once, you didn't have that feeling?
I did. I felt that the elections of last year, that was a very scary moment. That it wasn't a moment. It lasted maybe too long, and we saw what happened January 6th. I mean, to me, I wouldn't even say that's like a regular wake-up call. That is like loud and clear that something needs to change, and it's very fragile. But I still think that there are a lot of things, even with that moment, that I know there's a push for voter suppression and all these other things, but there's still a lot that works. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that. And that sort of connects to my goal. My mission is, and I think that's an important thing to state, is how do we support and prepare and educate? That is the big need of the 21st century. All these change makers. So they don't come to the university and they feel frustrated or feel like we're not giving them what the tools, the thinking, the space, the time, the freedom to emerge as really even stronger than when they first came. So I think it was a huge moment that indicates the level of fragility, but I still haven't experienced what I've seen in my own country and my experience with, in the Latin American region. I still think there's a big space where you see things functioning.
Interesting. Nikela, Patricia was just talking about, the university as a laboratory to grow bright minds and change makers. You have been a PhD student, and you were just sharing that you had decided maybe that you had other priorities. Could you talk about that a little bit in terms of being a student at a university setting?
Yeah, still technically enrolled, but
okay.
A PhD student studying environmental policy at UCSB. Doing that because I genuinely love school, and I love the university and the academy and growing my mind into like the kind of thinker that I would like to be. But studying environmental policy and reading the journal articles and books that time and time again highlight how urgent this crisis is, but how storytelling is such an effective method of persuasion against it. And then thinking about the next 5-6 years of my life as a PhD student in the academy, doing essay work and working towards attaining a PhD, it's like, is this how I'm going to spend the decade of the Green New Deal? What is an environmental policy PhD worth if we don't have a country, we don't have the environment to implement something like the Green New Deal? Thinking about being 30 years old and finishing school and feeling like there's nothing left for me because we took so long to tackle climate change. So it is sad. And I feel like a lot of people my age feel that way, that because we've been so failed by, people older than us, institutions, that now it's on us to try to salvage the future here. And it is kind of deeply unfair. But it is what it is. This is the hand that we've been dealt as young people in the United States of America. So that's why I feel like we organize and agitate with so much urgency, because we feel like there is so much at stake in this moment, and it's worth everything to us.
Yeah. Ethan, your theory of your current work is that distrust is an opportunity, a lever for change. Share some of that thinking with us.
So I think I would actually say that it's fuel, and fuel can be used to burn things down, but it can also be used to power things. So we saw fuel ignited by falsehoods from the president leaning to an attempt to burn things down on January 6th, and it was terrifying. But we can also see mistrust being something that basically gives permission to make change different ways. I'm seeing many people bump into frustration with the way that they're told to do civics and then finding other ways to do it. Probably my favorite example of this is the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who survived a brutal school shooting, who then went to the Florida State House to lobby their legislators for gun control. Not only did the legislators not stop session to meet with them, they actually tabled a bill blaming school violence on pornography. So essentially ignored the diagnosis entirely and worked on something that they thought would appeal to their base. The students responded by saying, all right, I guess we're not doing this through the legislature, and started doing a series of boycotts and pressure campaigns that led to a large number of U.S. businesses, including Delta Airlines, getting rid of discounts for NRA members, led to Dick's Sporting Goods stopping carrying military-style, high-magazine weapons, led to Walmart ultimately taking the ammunition for those weapons off the shelf. So I think part of what I'm seeing here is it's no good to pull on a lever that's stuck, right? At a certain point, I think people realize that many of the ways that we're told that we need to make change just don't work very well, or that they're not the right levers for us. That right now, to make social change through politics, you may need to be a lawyer, you may need to be empowered within the courts, but through storytelling, through social media, through changing norms, as well as through changing laws, through trying to figure out how to make change through technology and through markets, people can actually be immensely powerful. You look at a movement like Me Too. This is not a movement that needed new laws. There are laws on the book in every state in the United States prohibiting sexual assault. But there's been a culture that says that's the way things go. Harassment is part of business. It's part of being a woman in the world. And now you've had women standing up and saying, this is absolutely unacceptable. And when this happens, we're going to stand up and do something about it. There has been a sea change in many work cultures coming out of Me Too. I watched Me Too help take apart the department that I was in at MIT. And that was a good thing. That was really important and really worth doing. I don't know that it would have happened had not that norms-based, storytelling-based cultural movement changed the moment that we're within.
Yeah, super
Yeah,
interesting.
if
Yeah,
I
go
could
ahead,
hop on
Nikhila.
it. When you're talking about a lever being stuck, right? Like coming from someone in the youth climate movement, like we know that. Scott Peters, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, this is supposed to be our lever of change, right? We elect these people to go to Washington and do a job, and they don't. We know that if we want to get their attention, we have to go sit in their office, we have to take over the streets, we have to run a social media campaign and basically harass them on Twitter if we want to get their attention. They don't care about their constituents. Money in politics, maybe need to address that too. But yeah, the lever is clearly stuck, and that's one of our jobs is to find a creative way to pull it anyway, because we have to. Science is clear.
And I think I want to interrupt you, follow up on what Nikhila is saying, because I think that's the point that I was trying to make earlier on institutions are not listening to the people. But we have heard, the past speaker, we had the mayor, Alexandra Sotelo Solis, the mayor of National City, and speaking, that's one of the main focus in her area right now is how to make the people that she represents to feel that the government is listening. And that's not a minor thing. So I think that's essential. I mean, it shouldn't be that you have to harass people on social media, the people that we elect, for them to even pay any attention. So that's something that definitely needs to change. And anyway, I just wanted to add to what Nikhila was saying.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the how a little bit. Nikhila, you're an activist, an organizer. How do you go about organizing for change? What does that look like, in your day job, in the real world? What is the work?
That's a little tricky right now because of COVID. I feel like organizing has definitely slowed down. But let's go back to say like 2019, right? Use your imagination here in the old world. What this would look like is talking to people on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, creating events to hold panels and community activities, doing presentations at different organizations and at schools. Basically, as an organizer for the Sunrise Movement, advocating for the Green New Deal, trying to build as much community power and awareness around this piece of policy. So ideally, like you have some sort of campaign arc where you organize your community and your organization specifically towards an end goal, right? So like for a while, our end goal was the climate strike. So take the climate strike in December 2019, spending months trying to drum up as much people power to come out to a climate strike we were hosting to demand that. I think at the time it was Scott Peters co-sponsored the Green New Deal. But trying to work every avenue of change to just get as many people to come to this event as possible. And then once you get them there, like you don't want them to leave without understanding that this is not just a one-off event, right? But this is a movement. So recruiting them into your organization. And then the next step after that is actually training them, like teaching them, okay, this is how a movement works. This is what it means to be an organizer. This is the Green New Deal. And this cycle of act, recruit, train, it's what powers movements. And so many of the leaders now in the San Diego hub came into that position because of all of the grassroots organizing that we did. One of my favorite stories is sometimes we do like a banner drop where we like paint a banner, defund the police, Green New Deal now, whatever. And then we drop it off an overpass on say like the 5 or something like that. And one of the hub coordinators in San Diego, right, like our leader, actually saw our banner, and that's why she joined. So it's just creative tactics like that to get as many people into the movement and train them to be effective organizers as possible.
Yeah, you talked a little bit earlier when you and I were chatting about sort of preparing people for the moment, where you never really know when opportunity will arrive. but if we could prepare people to be to take action when the opportunity presents itself. Is that the way you think about, the sense of progress, unpredictable, but being prepared?
Yeah, it's that's called, like a trigger event or the moment of whirlwind. And like the last one we had was in June with the murder of George Floyd, when thousands of people, unorganized, not affiliated with anything, just felt so compelled to take action, they took to the streets. So like that's a moment where you capture the energy. And if you're able to channel it into some sort of organization to consolidate the people power, that's how you make long-term change.
Yeah. Yeah. Patricia, your discipline now is social entrepreneurship, which is, I guess, the study of the science of being effective in these sorts of movements. What are the lessons for this moment that you see?
Well, I mean, I think if we're talking about big problems, we need new paths, because I think Michaela makes a compelling case. I mean, we're not going to solve climate change just sitting in a classroom and studying policies. So we need to figure out new ways. But I also want to say that it requires, to create a system change. It needs to bring together different groups of people. It has to be multi-sector. It needs to be again, multi-stakeholder. And in order to do that, we need to figure out ways to do it. And even in that is very complicated. So we're focusing on social innovations that really move the needle, that look at problems in a different way, because we seem to be like always trying to do it, understanding just one way and then addressing it in similar paths that have not really led to the results that we want. And that's why we're here. Facing the situations that we face. So social innovation is a broader umbrella that tries to sort of think about how do we respond better to the people who require or need services or again, are part of society. So how do we respond better? How do we empower those who are disempowered? How do we include those who are not included? And all these issues require even modifications of power between, again, those providing services and those receiving services. So in order to do that, we have to sort of shift paradigms. And one of the things that I keep emphasizing in the idea of social innovation is that universities are in a great space to support that movement of new people, new generations who want to think about these issues differently and who want to work differently to find and develop solutions. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. I mean, I can go on and on, because social entrepreneurship in some ways just refers to one specific model. So let me give you one example. In San Diego, we have Kitchens for Good. That's a fabulous expression of a social innovation. It's a social entrepreneurship that tries to figure out how to do workforce development for people who have not had the chance, people who are emerged out of prison and people who might have experienced homelessness. And they do it through food education, and they become chefs at restaurants and all these other things. So that is just one expression of a social innovation in which we're thinking about, again, how do we incorporate, how do we create job opportunities, and how do we deal at the same time with issues of food waste? So social innovation is about bringing different elements in a different combination. It's about new processes. And it's also about bringing groups of people, and this might go to Nikela, it's not the young and the old. I mean, we need the young as much as the young might need us, even if they don't always see it. That is very important, to even if we don't all speak the same language or we don't always move in the same speed. So that's what I'm interested in doing from the university point of view. I think universities are in a great space to move this forward. One, I mean, think about the miracle of having a vaccine for COVID-19 in 1 year. I mean, that's gigantic. How does that happen? I mean, again, it happens at universities. It's people with the space and the freedom. And if you read the story of Kathleen Carrico, who discovered, sort of the protein synthesis in which the vaccine is based, there were a lot of failures. There's a lot of time. There's a lot of partnerships that make that happen. If we can solve that, we can solve so many other things. So universities, I'm not saying is the only thing, but they have, they are an important component. And one last thing I want to say, think about it. We want peace, but how much peace education do we provide in this country? The Kroc School was the first school of peace in the nation, and we were created in 2007. So we're saying we want all these things. We want change makers, we want innovators, we want people, who are fueling change, but we don't have the space for them that I think in order to create great change, it's needed.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you frame it a little bit like service and it's a little bit transactional, right? Like when we're talking here about issues like peace or justice or equity, do those things all work in the same way? I don't know. Maybe. Well, I guess like I'm thinking about the levers of change, right? Like, is it, and it might be the same to create a training program and an opportunity for employment as it is to tackle the big issues of equity and justice?
Well, I don't think it's one thing or the other. It's both of them. I mean, and the point I'm making, I don't want anybody to think it's just about training people. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have Z generation, we just heard Nikela, and there are many who want to create change. I believe people create change. I believe, like Ethan says, that mistrust of institutions, particularly institutions that we're seeing today, they're not listening to people, fuels that change that people want to create. But I don't think that's enough. It also needs, we need training, we need spaces for different sectors and groups of people, because it's not a Z generation, it's not older generation, it's not this group, it's not nonprofit for profits, it's all of it. And some of it starts in the community, some of it has to happen at other levels. That's what I'm trying to convey, because that's how you move the needle on big problems. It's not just here and it's not just here. It's all of those levels happening.
Yeah. Ethan, you go, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's right on. And I think, I noticed someone in the chat earlier saying, this is all civics. And that's absolutely right. The challenge is that our models for civics and for sort of teaching civics tend to be pretty old fashioned. We're actually a little afraid of teaching action civics in this country. People are very scared about doing something in the classroom that could actually lead towards political change, because the fear at that point is that you're using, your role as an educator to advocate. We're a little scared of this at the undergrad level. We're really scared of this at the high school level, which is honestly where some of the best energy is sort of coming from in all of this. Part of what I was trying to do with mistrust was sort of theorize, what are those levers of change? So I ended up suggesting that I've seen people be very effective making change using law, using norms, using markets, and also using technology or code, sort of, borrowing some terms from Larry Lessig a while back. But I also, I'm sort of suggesting that your position regarding an institution matters a lot. I've seen some people be very effective by going into an institution and trying to bring that institution back to its core values. There's a lot of work right now in the progressive DAs movement, where you're seeing people try to take the district attorney's office and sort of say, wait a second, our job is not to imprison Black and brown people. Our job is community justice, and to make sure that there's some resolution to someone being wronged. That can involve a lot of different things. That can involve drug treatment. That can involve restitution. That can involve community service. It doesn't have to always involve incarceration. You can see people position themselves to sort of pressure institutions. And I think I'm hearing some of that in Nikela's work. I'm hearing that in a lot of other activist work. It's also what journalists do to a very real extent. They try to hold institutions accountable. They try to make sure that they are being their best selves. I think we may need some more work in looking at institutions and saying, you know what, this one just doesn't work anymore. And we're going to route around it. We're going to build a new institution. We're going to build it on different principles. And I think that's the sort of the gospel that I'm trying to preach in this book, is that it's okay to conclude that this institution isn't working. The important thing at that point is to dig in and figure out, can you displace it? Can you build something else with it? Can you change it? What are the levers that you would use to get there? It does not have to be the vocabulary. It does not have to be the repertoire of civics that we've all grown very used to.
Yeah,
If I
both.
could,
Yeah,
if
both.
I could,
Go ahead, McKenna. Go ahead, McKenna.
Yeah. What you're, there's an echo, I think. Okay. What you're saying about like bringing institutions back to the core, right? Like reminding them of why they were established and their mission and principles to begin with. For me, and I think for a lot of other like young brown and black people in this country, we know that these institutions were not created with us in mind. And the whole history of our people in this country is like fighting to not bring like institutions closer to their core, to their original intention, but further away from that. Like trying to make the founding text of the Constitution more true to us in the future, because at the beginning, it was meant to oppress and colonize and enslave. And that's the origins of our institutions. And that's why I feel like we have so many issues in this country, is because we are unwilling to acknowledge that history, unwilling to acknowledge our story and our origins. And we just pretend like past 400 years never happened.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question, maybe both to Ethan and Nikayla. At the beginning, at the top of this hour, you both talked about the need for pretty radical institutional change. Now I'm sensing maybe you guys are pointed a little bit in different directions. Like when we think about the kind of change that needs to occur to get at these big issues in America, or whether America is even the right framing. I want to
make sure we don't. I want to make sure we don't lose Nikayla's point. There's no way to look at what's going on with America right now without wrestling with 400 years of structural racism, and the fact that it's built into the ways in which institutions fail us. We're having a conversation right now about the filibuster. The history of the filibuster is a history of white supremacy. It's basically been a tool that's been systemically used over time to try to allow a small number of pro-segregation, pro-slavery voices to be able to throw a wrench in the works. So, we absolutely do have to sort of acknowledge those legacies as some way of sort of moving them forward. Look, I am not so brave that I believe that I have a good solution to fixing America at the moment. That seems a little broad for me. I'm trying to bite off something a little smaller. I'm trying to do a lot of work on fixing social media, which is an institution that's frankly only been with us about 15 years. It's only really been powerful, for 5 or 6 years, and which I think most people would acknowledge is pretty badly broken. So a lot of my work is trying to help people say, look, there's no, divine mandate that says that Mark Zuckerberg has to control our public spaces. We could imagine and fund and build very different ways to interact with one another online. And I think if we can get beyond, these endless congressional hearings where we yell at Zuckerberg and then he goes back to doing exactly what he was doing, and actually come up with an optimistic vision and start building towards it, we could have a very clear example of taking a failed institution and building one that serves us better. My hope is that people like Nikayla are going to pick up different part of the work on different institutions. It's too much for any of us to try to fix the whole thing. But it's also irresponsible to sort of look at this and say, well, I can't fix the whole thing, therefore I'm not going to dig into it. I think the real work in some ways is figuring out what is an institution where you are uniquely positioned to be able to make change around it. For me, for a bunch of historical reasons, I actually have a good deal of power and expertise in trying to fix social media. But my guess is that that's actually true for a lot of people, and that we can sort of put ourselves in that situation of saying, where can I actually take a stand, put in a lever, and try to move part of the world?
Yeah, interesting. I think, Nikayla, this goes to some of your thinking about community organizing as opposed to a large, trying to take on the whole world.
Yeah, the United States has 350 million people. That is a massive number of people to try to organize and align on an idea at one time. But we all still share core values as a country, and I believe that firmly across age, race, class. I feel like we all share a similar idea of what this country like should and can and will be. White supremacy, the alt-right, that whole thing, it's there. And we need to acknowledge that. But I don't think that that's the majority. Maybe that's a little naive and optimistic of me. But I do believe that, like, in the goodness of the United States of America at the core. And I think to reach that, like I said, the amount of people we have nationally, too big. So starting at local communities, working from there, building grassroots power from the bottom up. I think that's the way to enact change.
Yeah, I think this issue of localism is a pretty current topic and a pretty important one. Ethan, I think I remember you talking about sort of the problem of scale from the origins, the beginnings of the country, tainted as they may be, to what we're trying to cope with now, both in just the populace of the country, these mega platforms like social media. Seemed like a great idea. Connect all the world's people. What could go wrong? But it turns out that working at that scale has got all sorts of downsides, and I think we're seeing it in a lot of ways.
Scale is incredibly important when we talk about communities. We know how to handle communities of 30, 300, maybe 3,000. We're not so good at 30,000. We might be able to find a way to do it. Once you get up to 3 billion, which is what Facebook claims to be a community of, you gotta use the air quotes there, right? There is no such thing as a community of 3 billion people. And so in some ways we have to find ways to sort of break our systems down, make them quite a bit smaller. One of the few, practical suggestions, and believe it or not, this is what passes for a practical suggestion for me, in my book about the US government, is going back to the ratio of representatives to people that George Washington advocated for. He ended up saying that in writing the Constitution, it was critically important that we have one representative for 30,000 people, not 40,000 people. That would have been too much. 30,000. If you do that now, we would have 11,000 representatives. Obviously, it's real hard to house them in the Capitol at that point, but you know what? We don't have to. We can make decisions over the internet. You would radically change Congress if you had an 11,000 member House. You would have your congressperson living in your neighborhood, not just your city, but in your local neighborhood. And it would be someone with whom you had a personal relationship. Gets real hard to lobby them when you have 11,000 spread out throughout the country. By the way, you don't need a constitutional amendment to do this. That's actually what's in the Constitution. All you actually have to do is reapportion and sort of raise that number. So if we wanted to get beyond big and sort of return to small, return to communities of people who know each other and work together, it's absolutely possible to do these things. That's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do around social media. My hope is not to create a 3 billion user Facebook killer. That would be a terrible tragedy. The hope instead is to create millions of platforms that have 30 to 3,000 people on each of them that are actually governed by the people who use them. That's much closer to a vision of what healthy and democratic media looks like. It's at a human scale.
Interesting. That is a little bit aligned with your vision, Patricia, of the university as a viable and progressive community, the institution that sort of brought us through the Middle Ages. It's worked before. You want to say more about that role?
Well, I mean, again, I think there is a reason why the universities have existed since what is it, 1500, for many, many centuries. And I want to keep on emphasizing that we need to do more, and we need to respond better. We also have to be the type of institution that listens more carefully to what people are saying. I think there are a lot of criticisms of universities and higher ed, and we need to always go back to what is our core purpose. But the core purpose, like I said, I divided in two big issues that I think are very important for contributing to address the big problems that we face in the United States and also in the world. One is creating the space, the freedom for people, talented people, to develop ideas. I mean, if you think about change, you think, I think there's consensus. People create change. And if we go back to Ethan's book, mistrust of institutions fuels change. And here is a way, in any of the themes that I work on, for example, corporate social responsibility. It just starts as a set of ideas in academics, in activists, in business leaders, and eventually it happens. When the SEC is talking about ESG, environmental, social, and government being part of disclosures, that's a big change. So I think universities, whether it's in science, humanities, in any area, has a role to play. And then the second one is, think about it. If you go back to the 20th century, early 20th century, there were no business schools. And all of a sudden, there was the expansion in the United States, the railroads and emerging business, and then came, after World War II, huge businesses. They needed a managerial group, and they started developing business schools that train people. I think we need to have schools more and more, and academia needs to shift and not just in the classroom, but it's through high impact learning, people who experience what does it mean to create change, what does it mean to lead systems change, not like I said, not just at the community level, that's very important, but beyond that, at the different layers, and it's just very complicated. So I think universities, if we really believe that people create change, I think the universities must play an important role. And I'm very excited because that's what I do. That's what I'm committed to. There's something going on. Huh?
Sorry, I interrupted. As I'm listening to this conversation, I feel like there's some, the unspoken underpinnings, the shibboleths that surround all these conversations, like capitalism seems to be like an assumption, but one that's increasingly challenged. Democracy, a pretty unchallenged thought, but the way it's executed, I think it's increasingly under questioning. And the whole framing around nationhood as well is like this. What can we do for America is an interesting question to me. Nikayla, you're a visionary for the future. How do you see those arguments playing out?
I do not see a future where capitalism solves climate change. Capitalism is the root cause of the crisis, and markets are not going to innovate or profit our way out of this hole that we're in, because we've gotten away from viewing people as the most important part of the crisis, and capitalism favors profit. And those two things, they're not compatible to any long-term comprehensive solution based in community care. So I look to the future and I see a future free of capitalism and markets dictating people's livelihoods and whether or not they go to school and have healthcare or have enough to eat. But instead, we choose as people to choose each other and to see the humanity in one another and the duty and obligation we have to care for each other as people bound to a common fate. So that is my hope for the solution out of all of this. And I know it to be probably the only solution out of all of this.
Yeah. Ethan, any thoughts from you on those big three? I know you wrestle with all these ideas.
I think I'm just hoping that we can be braver. I think, one response to Nikayla is to sort of say, yeah, good luck getting rid of capitalism. I think the other response is to say, no, actually, we're seeing places where that's already happening. We're seeing mutual aid. We're seeing volunteerism. Sometimes we're seeing it in very weird places. We look at something like Wikipedia and sort of wonder, how can something so remarkable be run by volunteer labor? Maybe what we actually need to do is just get better at sort of celebrating the things that break the rules of how we think things need to be. Maybe we just need a lot of proof that many of these assumptions that we end up making are not necessarily the right assumptions, and that the people who are willing to challenge those assumptions and build something even better are the people who we want to emulate and who we want to lead us.
It was beautifully said. And we're just about at the end of our hour. Any closing thoughts from our other two guests? Patricia, any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I want to emphasize this idea that it was the first speaker series that we had on democracy for all of us. It was Eric Ward, and it just stayed in my mind and for the last couple of months is something that I talk about also in some of my classes, is always keeping in mind, as frustrating as it might be, this idea of how change takes time. And I know sometimes we can't wait. But I always think about the reality that 100 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to vote even as a new American. And now I am. And how many years and how many efforts it took. Yes, I wish it weren't that way, but it seems to be. So I think it is a long game for the big problems that we face. I'm glad that all the people who care about these big problems, we have seen it with the three of us, or maybe with the four of us, because I want to include you, Jeff. We have different personalities. We have people who think, no, I got to do it, and it has to be now. Other people say, yes, it has to change, but this is my approach. And I think we need to be inclusive. We have Ethan writing books and giving talks, and he has his own more focus project. So I think all of it is needed. And how do we support each other's journey into change making? I think it's very important. So change takes time. And as we get impatient, also let's go back and look at some of the things that we had before, because there has been great progress. And I feel very fortunate to be, experiencing some of the benefits of the fights of those who came before me. So I don't lose sight of that. It motivates me. Go ahead.
We've come to the end of our time. Nikayla, the last word is yours.
Yeah, I want to say, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. Obviously, this is an academic institution, and I also want to highlight the importance of academia and universities in the fight that we have ahead, because it's not just activists and it's not just academics, right? But it's also artists too. Like, we all have our role to play in this, and if we can play the role that brings us the most joy, I think that's how we continue the long game, because it is a long game. I want to win today, but I know reading history, I'm not going to win today. But it's about the small wins along the way, aimed towards this bigger goal.
Okay, beautifully said. Okay, in closing, I want to say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the Kroc School for organizing the Democracy for All of Us series. We're living through a scary and maybe an exciting time, so it's an important moment to be having these conversations. Thank you to you all, and good night.